You will wave your hand a little bit in a gesture of greeting so that we can know I meant when I introduce you. I'm having a wonderful
So,
talk, this time with fellow Southern Californians. I'm not talking to somebody on a mountain in
right,
Scotland as I did
right.
recently. I'm having a great chat with composer Richard Thompson. Wave. Thank you. Composer Richard Thompson and conductor Stephen Tucker. Guess who that is? Okay. We are going to talk about the 2019 2 CD Navona release. What a great uh, extensive label Navona is. How wonderful that they are so supportive of these kind of projects. 2019 2 CD Navona release. Thompson's chamber opera in 3 weeks. The Mask in the Mirror. And it's I'm really quoting from the program notes, but it's the tragic romance of Paul Laurence Dunbar, who was probably African American's first greatest poet. Am I close there for this country? Go ahead. Jump in.
Some people would dispute that, but he was the first well noted, I should say.
Yeah, and he did tour after all. You
Yeah.
know,
He was the first really successful,
Yes.
not just
there's
financially, but in terms of national and international recognition.
Paul Laurence Dunbar, and his years are very, very interesting. We're going to talk about them, I hope, if we get time. 1872 to 1906. And what I'm getting at is Reconstruction has failed in the South.
Hmm.
Yes?
The lynchings are just getting started. In
Yeah.
other words, the beginning of the really bad times are coming in the late 1870s right up to, well, let's try and stop at the 1940s, okay? Horrible. So here is a man who was so conflicted about at so many levels and was in that period, so one can be somewhat empathic. And his tremendous, uh, even a little bit troubled, well, very troubled love affair, marriage, and finally divorce with the novelist Alice Ruth Moore. 1875, she outlived him tremendously. She lived
Yeah.
till 1935.
Right.
And this opera is, well, it's about dysfunction, isn't it? I mean, all kinds of dysfunction, codependency, for all kinds of very, very good reasons. Why don't we, and then we'll get to the cast here in a minute. I'll ask you to tell me about your wonderful cast for this opera. But Richard, why don't you kind of give me a little overview of what is the purpose of this work you've created about these two very troubled people?
That's a great question. I mean, first of all, I had no intention of writing an opera. I read some of his poems, and I said a couple of poems, and read a book about his life, and I saw that his life was very interesting. So my initial idea was to write some short theater piece, uh, something for between 6 and 10 minutes, just
Interesting.
dealing with some aspect of his life. So I started thinking about that, and I discovered that all the letters that they exchanged while they were courting had been collected as a PhD thesis. So I got all the letters and I read them, and I realized this was a fantastic story that needed to be told in its entirety, not just one small segment. And apart from all the dysfunction, one of the things that I found really interesting was the tremendous strength of will. He was somebody who published a book of poetry when he was a teenager, in his, I think, his last year of high school. So if you think about what actually happened, he went to a publisher in Dayton with a bunch of poems and no money. And he said, well, I need 1,000 copies of this. I'll pay you back after I sell them.
Yeah.
That's pretty extraordinary. So obviously he had something in him, a certain
Sure.
kind of energy, conviction that uh, allowed him to do this. He did that. He sold all the 1,000 copies while working as an elevator boy in a department store, and I guess walking around Dayton, whatever else. And then he did the same thing again. When he did the second time, the volume called Majors and Minors, he attracted the attention of the major critic, Dean Howells. So to me, the fact that he was the child of two ex-slaves who couldn't read, he managed to get a good education, become a poet, get published, and reach this level of recognition
Hmm.
with only a high school background is pretty amazing. And then when you factor in the times he was living in, the age of the post-Reconstruction age, it's all the more remarkable. It's a really
Yes.
special story.
And so that is the beauty of this struggle, and isn't it so with so many great artists and great achievers? So many troubling, maybe let's say, personal problems. And by the way, we suspect we don't know because it's a different age, but I think we can agree it's mentioned somewhat. But possibly this man was suffering from bipolar disease. There are indications in his behavior. Certainly, the
Yes.
oppression of being African American at that time in America, in the South, even. I mean, it's part of his family in New Orleans, even Dayton, Ohio. I mean, all the wonderful plays. I've forgotten the author now, but of the 10-play series about the movement from the South to the North, and the exact same racism in Pittsburgh and Cleveland.
You mean August Wilson, the Century
And
Side?
August Wilson,
Really?
what amazing plays. So it's a great and tragic story. Also, we have a man who, against all odds, as you have indicated, became really quite famous. I mean, he went off to London and
Yes.
did readings in London and so on. And he was, shall we say, maybe compulsive in terms of his lusts. Lots of women in his life, and his compulsive falling in love with Alice Ruth Moore, who was a kind of was not a very successful writer. So this amazing pairing of the successful, the unsuccessful, the dependent, the codependent, it makes for a marvelous story. Let's ask. Why don't I ask? Stephen, if that's appropriate, to give me a little indication of this cast. And let me just call off the names, and you give me a little rundown on them. They're wonderful people. Tenor, Cameo Humes, wonderful voice.
I met Cameo at our first rehearsal, which Richard will remember was actually at the recording studio. And when I met Cameo, and I wanted to know how Richard knew him, and Cameo had sung a performance of Paul Laurence Dunbar, am I correct?
Yes,
a trilogy opera. So the two primary protagonists, Paul and Alice Ruth Moore, they had already looked at the score. So when I met them in rehearsal, they had experienced a little of it. So it was actually good getting to know them on the project. So that's Cameo and Angela. So
Angela Owen, soprano, who
right.
plays Alice. Those are the two main characters, tenor Cameo Humes as Paul, and Paul Laurence Dunbar, and Angela Owens as Alice Ruth Moore. And then a wonderful subsidiary cast, mezzo. Lindsay Patterson, am I pronouncing her name right?
Correct.
Abdul. Lindsay Patterson Abdul. Tell me about her. She's a wonderful voice.
I met Lindsay when I was music director and artistic director at the Riverside Lyric Opera, which was an interesting experience because I couldn't figure out if Lindsay was a soprano or a mezzo, because she was doing both roles in different places, at Long Beach and all sorts of places. So when we were discussing who could do these mother's roles, it just struck me that Lindsay would be ideal, because if it went high, she was fine. If it went low, she was okay. So she came in and did a fantastic job. We were so excited when she came in to record.
And soprano Liberta Laurel really is quite an amazing, wonderful, incredible voice, but also so versatile in this. She plays 2 or 3 roles anyway, sings 2 or 3 roles in the opera. And by the way, later I want to ask how that works in terms of staging. But give me a little something. Do they just literally pull off the wig and throw on the other hat, or what?
Well, I'll have Richard talk about Liberta, because
Sure.
we had to make concessions. For the recording project, we had to discuss funding, and it's not as easy to get all these great people, and multiplicity of singers to come in and do things. So Richard had a great idea. He said to me, "No, we could have a couple of people, 2 or 3 people, do different roles." And I thought, okay, that's fine for a recording, but your question actually presents a problem that wouldn't happen in a
I see.
stage performance because I don't think we would use the same people.
Okay, now I get it. Yeah.
Right,
But I
right.
thought, if you're, chamber opera, what a great idea. And then that's why I became so kind of curious about how this is. So in other words, in a fully staged production, well, all of the characters will be sung by different singers. But in the recording, for very, very reasonable reasons, soprano Liberta Lorau apparently took on the greater part of this story. Wonderful, by the way, as well. Her characterizations are immediately different for each of the characters.
I,
Yeah.
I must point out that Lindsay did sing three roles because she sang the headmistress
Yeah.
And the two mothers.
and the two mothers.
And the two mothers. Okay, thank you. We get that. Thank you for
Yeah.
clarifying that very well. Soprano Natalie Mann, who wants to speak about?
Again, Natalie, I met when she moved to California. She was teaching in Riverside area. She came to be a part of the Riverside Lyric Opera, and we had done recitals together. I accompanied her, and when we thought about who could be Paul's lover in London, I just thought, oh, Natalie would be perfect, and she came in and just nailed it.
Yeah, absolutely. Very, very impressive voice, very impressive role playing, even audibly. If you get my drift, I knew that her characterization. Tenor Roland Mills
You
was.
worked with you worked with
No, you worked with him first.
Yes. I worked with Roland, and then I recommended Roland to Richard, which was an interesting combination because during Mask, we called him in to play both the drinking buddy and the sales rep.
Yeah.
And he did such a good job that Richard cast him in something else, in a live performance. What work was that?
I wrote a piece honoring and celebrating the life of Martin Luther King called Freedom. So I had him sing, I said part of Martin Luther King's I Have a Dream speech to music. So I called in Roland to sing that part. It was a concert given by the SDSU Orchestra and Choir last year. So I had Roland and Lindsay. Lindsay sang a soprano role in that piece also.
Wonderful. Well, that's what the business is all about.
Yep.
You
Yes.
do a gig, somebody says, "Hey, you're good. How about you do another gig for me?" That's perfect.
Exactly.
Let's see. We've discussed. I think we've discussed com- composer Richard Thompson, and we mentioned Stephen. Are you guys happy with the credits? I think we got the credits, didn't we?
Absolutely.
Yes.
We're alive.
Stephen, tell me about the. Uh-oh, I just forgot. Sanaa. No, the Sanaa
Sanaa.
Opera Project. Pronounce it.
Well, now I know as of about 3 or 4 days ago, it's Sané.
Sanaa.
So I wanted a name that was special for the project and also Afrocentric. And somehow I came across the name. No, a friend of mine suggested the name Sané. And apparently it means work of art and beauty. And I thought, well, that's the perfect name. I didn't want to use something that was sort of just purely functional, like Mask in the Mirror Opera Company, something that's functional with no personality. So I wanted something with a personality which would work for this project and possibly for something else in the future that struck a certain kind of
Exactly.
tone, it's memorable and not just a purely functional thing.
Yeah. And by the way, that's a great idea. I figured that's why I asked that this was a project name that has some legs.
Exactly.
For other projects, has some legs. Okay, now let's just sort of do a little dissecting. We have to return to this business. I want both of you. I don't know who to ask to go first. You guys fight over it, but again, I just want to try and deal with these levels. There are huge multi-level issues. Giant. We're not just talking personal issues. We're talking giant societal issues about racism, all of it, as we all can figure from this story. But how much for example, how much behavior? That's just one issue. How much behavior can be forgiven by a genius? I think that's an issue. Here's this guy. He became an alcoholic, rowdy, troublesome. The marriage collapses, and he was a genius. There's one. Let me dump a couple at you, and then we'll see what happens. About flawed genius. And also race, this idea of reaching a certain threshold and you just cannot get beyond it. I think he complained, his letters complained, that he was being, in the note program, was being recognized, traveling to Europe, and yet still practically, coming in the servant's door. All the praise meant nothing. That whole business of masks, and a little later I'm going to read it. Who wants to go first on those juicy issues?
Why don't you?
Well, I knew you'd say that. Well, those are two great questions, and I still wrestle with the first one. I think one of the first things is that we assume that people of genius, whatever kind of genius it is in whatever field, we kind of suppose that they are all around superior human beings, that they're filled with, higher intelligence, a great sense of compassion, humanity, etc. Well, history does not support that idea. You can be a genius and be severely flawed. That's something I think we need to come to terms with, that genius is just one aspect of a person's personality. It doesn't make that person a better human being than anybody else.
Mm-hmm.
And that's a hard one, a bitter pill to swallow, because we see somebody who creates beautiful music. So at a certain level, we assume that that person is a beautiful human being. That may not be the truth. In fact, the history of music in several different genres is filled with stories of people who were great composers, but in their practical lives were quite simply absolute jerks.
Yeah.
There's no need to mention names.
That's right. I was just going to say that.
In addition,
jumped to mind.
Yes. In addition to that point, your part of your question was, is it forgivable? And I will say, let's assume it's forgivable, but the person who is the jerk, the genius jerk, does not get to call the forgiveness. It has to be done by society, and society has done that over and over to people who we deem geniuses, and we've decided to wink at certain things. But Paul's problem was he thought he deserved it because he said he should have it. And that was his greatest flaw, was that he thought he was a genius, which most people thought also, but then he went on further to say, my genius demands that I be allowed to do whatever I want to do.
Yeah. And you can forgive him even that, I think, in a way, can't you? Because of the circumstances. I don't mean the alcoholism, but again, the circumstances of overwhelming racism, in the country, particularly at that time. I don't know. Just the bitterness must have been overwhelming. So there's so many things that I, as a white man, can forgive readily based on the torture that this man went through, knowing he was brilliant and a genius and all the rest. And then, where do you draw the line at abuse or what? Yes, speak, please.
Well, a couple of things that are worth mentioning. He grew up in a very dysfunctional family. His father fought in the Civil War, and from what I have gathered from reading, he was probably shell-shocked. His father was abusive. So he grew up in this atmosphere. So at a certain level, he must have normalized abusive behavior. Also at that time, there was no available psychotherapy. So as a young man, he's walking around with all these problems and issues with no real counseling or outlet. And let's not forget, he was still very young. He didn't live to be 40, 50, or 60. So at his age, he hadn't really learned how to deal with all these problems properly. And he didn't get any help. Because I don't think anybody went to psychotherapy in America in the 1890s. Or
let alone African Americans, you know what I mean?
Exactly.
Just completely cut off from all of that.
Exactly. So he had no help. His only outlet was being creative, and of course, with his health problem, his drinking. So it was really doomed to failure. There's no.
And also self-fulfilling, maybe even. You know how people get into a self-fulfilling track: bitterness, alcoholism, and so on. He was dead at age 33 of acute alcoholism. And his marriage had failed. He was, he had passionately and that might be a misnomer in love with Alice Ruth Moore. And as we mentioned a little earlier, and then I want to speak about the music because we're here to talk about the music, but the story is so dense. I mentioned earlier codependency. Alice Ruth Moore, obviously, and a little further down I have a couple of quotes from their letters, but obviously, well, co-facilitated all of these things, loved him, if you will. And then this thing about he's successful, she isn't, she rides on his coattails. I mean, the complexity of human relationships is is in this chamber opera in spades and then some. So congratulations on giving us one hell of a story.
Well, thank you.
Okay, let's see where else am I? Let me run down a little bit. I'm dying to find a quote. So we talked about the vulnerable woman writer falling for the far more famous poet, all that stuff. And by the way, she was prejudiced as well. Alice
Yes.
was prejudiced. Her skin color was lighter, and she was troubled by people with darker skin. I mean, the complexity of being black, said the white guy here, has to be, in my view, really nearly overwhelming even now. So believe me, I hope I understand a little tiny bit how hard it is, even now as we speak. So when did you discover the poet Paul Laurence Dunbar? May I ask?
It would have been, let's see, in the late 90s. Actually, I did a musical. I played keyboard in a musical in the early 90s. It was a setting of a play or novel by Ntozake Shange, who died recently, called Betsy Brown. And in that novel, it's autobiographical, so it's actually happened. It's not fictional. She gets up and recites a dialect poem by Dunbar, and the whole class starts laughing. So I never heard of him before. So all I knew was that he'd written some dialect poems. And a couple of years later, middle 90s, I went to this African-American Afrocentric bookstore in Brooklyn. And lo and behold, they had the complete works of Dunbar. And they had all his various publications. And I found out that he had poems in dialect and in standard English. So I bought it out of curiosity, and I read several poems, and I set a couple to music for my jazz group. I said, "We Wear the Mask," and I forgot what else. And I just became interested in his work. And it's just a string of apparently random events that led me to him, because I'd heard the name, I heard this dialect poem, which I didn't really relate to in any particularly strong way.
As a Scotsman?
As a Scotsman, as a black Scotsman, yes. As a kid, I used to read Robert Burns at school. But,
I'm glad you're friends.
Well, Dan, you started something that I don't want us to get off. I want to talk about Richard's music.
Yes.
Because I do want to give my impressions. Richard reminded me that we've known each other since, 2007? So
yes.
Not very long, right? But he brought me his sketch of the opera. Was it a sketch, or you had done the piano scoring of it?
It was a piano vocal score.
Piano vocal score. And he brought it up and came into my office here and sat down at the piano, and he played it. And I can't remember when this was, but I said, "We're doing that."
I remember that very clearly. I was shocked.
He reminded me of this just maybe a year ago or within the last year. He said, "I'll never forget when I played the piano vocal for you, and you just stood there and just said, 'We're doing this.'" And it turned out that it had its premiere. I didn't conduct that. It was done in New Jersey. And then we just kept talking about it needing to be recorded. So when we finally sat down and said, we have to plan this, and we started getting funding and musicians together, we actually realized that it was happening.
Yeah.
We were actually doing it. But the thing that impressed me most was that when we got to the studio, knowing how little time we had, and the orchestra got together and they were there, and we started working, um, we would look at each other during every break and go, how is this going so well? This is, I mean, essentially the orchestra is sight reading this. And knowing the time limitations we had, we just had to go. And we were setting out things every morning, schedule, what we needed to accomplish. And we were just moving because we had to accomplish it. And it was happening. And the players would come to me and go, and I'm sure they spoke with Richard too, and they go, hey, this is amazing stuff. What? And they would ask him if he would write stuff for them. And so it was just this wonderful experience where everybody in the studio, including the engineer, who is a Grammy Award-winning engineer, was just so impressed with how things were flowing. But it's because the substance of the music and how it depicted the two characters in the story, it was so well woven. And I want to make sure that we all remember that he wrote every single note there.
and it's clearly the Scotsman in him. I'm convinced of it. Because my impression is beautifully constructed, wonderful use of chamber musicians of these kind of colors, the wind sounds. There's a wonderful French horn moment that I remember, but also when the writing is done well. May I just congratulate you? It plays well. What can I say? And I think Stephen, you've just described that. The musicians sat down, they played it, it made sense, it all worked, everything went fine, which speaks to the music. By the way, I kind of want an idea. This is an opera I should be listening to 7 or 8 or 9 more times before I dare to interview you. You know that we've had to kind of put it together quickly, but I'm curious about what I think I sense in the progression of the 3 acts, also musically. It seems to me as though the work almost becomes more and more melodic and gorgeous and beautiful as it progresses towards its denouement and finale. In other words, I was kind of expecting something else. I don't know quite what, but the idea that the piece becomes more embracing and beautiful as the troubles, even second act, continue, and then in the last act, the collapse and final death are so touching and so moving. Whereas I've had a kind of feeling that the first act was a little more kind of taking care of business, getting things organized and stuff. Can you speak to that? Tell me if I'm all wet or what. Did I sense anything there?
Well, first of all, you're right. The first act in any opera, the first few scenes, have to be expository. So you learn something about the nature of the characters and their background. So when they start to interact, there's a basis for understanding how they interact. In terms of the development of musical style, I didn't think, well, I'm going to be more lyrical in this scene or less lyrical in that scene. My starting point when I set words is always the same. I read the text. If I have a strong emotional and intellectual connection to the text, I hear music. So the music I write, I think of as being heightened speech.
Maybe that has something to do with such beauty. I didn't have the libretto here with me, but the clarity of the diction is so perfect, really, on the CD. But it seems maybe I'm kind of with you about the text becoming so much more lyrical, really, as it worked out. Can I just? Yeah, go ahead, please.
I have an impression because I had to come to it from a studio standpoint. I had to learn the score and get myself. And so I see your sweep exactly the way you said it. But what I read, and we never spoke about this, I read resignation. And by the third act, almost everybody had come to accept that there was not going to be any change of character. Paul was going to be Paul. Alice was already Alice, and she was so stubborn, and that powerful word she used, that one word answer to his question, she just said no in a letter. And so it's almost as if by this point, it's all resignation. And therefore, there is no turmoil I sensed from there on, it was just, let's resolve this. And then it became so much more rewarding, the melodic writing. That's
Beautifully
what.
put, and how Schubertian.
Yeah.
The
Yeah.
last songs, you know, when the resignation comes is the
Right.
most peaceful moments. I'm
Right.
speaking in huge generalities, but that's so. Thank you for helping to describe what I experienced more
Yeah.
clearly. Let me just. I'm going to throw out a couple of quotes and see what we got about the scene where Dean Howells sung beautifully by John Paul Hamas. I hope I got it. Paul Hamas,
Okay.
playing the literary critic at his gentleman's club. A bit of praise for this black poet, but the poet himself says they'd rather see the mask than the human face below. We wear the mask that grins and lies. It hides our cheeks and shades our eyes. This debt we pay to human guile. With torn and bleeding hearts we smile. Oh my God. Anybody want to speak to that?
Well, I think it's such a great poem,
Hmm.
and it's. I think one of the first things I think is that the words of that poem are still true today in 2019. The ability, or the lack of the ability to see African Americans as people as they truly are and not fitting into stereotypical images is a national problem that exists on all levels of society, from the most educated down to the least educated. It's a real struggle for, in this country that really is sadly still racially divided, for people to see people, as human beings, and not as examples of stereotypes, whatever those stereotypes may be.
And it's
And
hard for all of us, by the way. I think it's hard for all of us. I
yes,
catch myself frequently where I just go, "What did you just think?" For
mhm.
example, you know,
When you
it's a.
come,
Go ahead.
sorry. I said when you add in the conflict of the violent and bitter racial history of this country, when you're dealing with stereotypes that are based on race, that are deeply ingrained, it makes the problem even more difficult because there are people who are unconsciously racist who think they're just fine. They don't see their own negative expectations and suppositions because again they're so deeply burned into the
Exactly.
psyche from childhood
Yeah.
that they've normalized it and think it's fine.
So
But
we're
here's
a long
somebody,
way. We're moving, but we're a long way
you know,
still
it
because of
takes a
some.
lot. I often say to my friends, well, the universe is, as far as we know, 13.77 billion years old. So what we've done in the past a few thousand years is not even a drop in the bucket. There's a
Right.
lot of work to be done. And it's a matter of making constant work and not resting on one's laurels and saying, for example, the in phrase a few years ago was, well, that was then, this is now. Well, things are slightly better, worldwide in many areas, but there's still much to be done.
That's
And
what
it's a
we've discovered in the
constant,
past couple of
constant
years.
vigilance. That's the answer.
Yeah.
Stephen, please.
What I find most impressive, though, about Dunbar is that if you the text you just read, I mean, we wear the mask. He sums up so much because he's summing up what is expected of him and what he is able to contribute, which is okay. I know they only want to see that mask, what they expect of us, and I essentially what he's saying is I am doing what they expect because I have to survive. It's so by saying we wear the mask, he's saying we know the game. We know what is expected. But in order for us to survive, and in his particular case, to be as successful literarily as he is saying, I am doing this. Don't think that I don't write I write these poems in dialect, not knowing that that's what you want.
Yeah.
As he says very clearly, quote, I know why the caged bird sings.
Absolutely.
Just
That's
amazing. By the way, that's a beautiful scene in Act Two. Beautiful scene. How can we kind of bring this down? We're getting at 35 minutes. I think somebody has a train to catch back to San Diego. Let's any last thoughts between the two of you? What I experienced was a wonderful chamber opera, very well written, contemporary music, but very very accessible. Some wonderful little moments. We didn't get a chance to touch on the jazz influences and jazz moments. The third stream idea of Gunther Schuller's. Peek up now and again in the opera. It's beautifully written for voice, obviously well written for instrumentalists. Everybody said, "Oh, hey, we enjoyed playing that opera." Anything else that we can say? And then I'll do a little closing.
One thing that was important to me when I was working on it is that the piece should have an educational value, as well as giving an insight into life at the end of the 19th century. As we just said, it gives an insight into life in America now. It isn't just a period piece that you can put in a historical book. So that's what happened roughly 100 years ago. But the main themes of that opera are still alive in our current society, and also his rise from rags to riches, as well as being a monumental success story, is the kind of success story I think could only have happened in this country because of the nature, the way the society is stitched together. I don't see something similar happening, say, in other countries, say in Europe. I think there's something singularly American about that kind of experience.
Despite everything, with his success, I've heard this before in recent interviews, Europeans, interviewing other Europeans, and still there is this understanding, with all of our troubles that we certainly have now, that only in America does these kind of opportunities happen. Excuse me, please, Stephen.
Yes, one of the things I would like to, and I plan to walk away from this project thinking, is a quote I will always give people. I had a very good friend of mine who is a pianist who, went to Juilliard and everything, and she teaches piano now, very successful piano soloist and teacher. I had her listen to it, and before she got to even the second CD, she called and left me a message. And she said, "Oh my goodness, this has got to be performed everywhere. People have to hear this." And she said, I'm thinking of the story, but I'm also hearing the music, and I'm thinking, this must be heard. And I'll never forget when I listened to the message, the excitement. She obviously was in the car driving when she was leaving this message, and I thought, wow, that's a musician who's used to Wagner and Schoenberg and Strauss, and here she's reacting to your music this way. And I keep that very alive in my consciousness because I know how much work we put in. I mean, from recording to all the mixing sessions, sitting there trying to decide how it should really feel, in terms of balance and all that stuff. And to come away hearing somebody who's a really highly skilled musician saying, this should be everywhere. So I want to make sure, I never told you this.
Well, thank you.
So,
Wonderful. Well, that is exactly right. And again, I became a pianist friends of mine just finished recording the complete piano works of Nathaniel Dett.
mm-hmm.
So in the course of preparing for Clipper Erickson, pianist Clipper Erickson, in the course of preparing to chat with him, he's an old friend and son, but I had never heard of Nathaniel Dett before. I had no idea. His story, I guess, was a little gentler, I think, because he was his career was in America, but he was kind of Canadian. You know what I mean? Maybe a gentler people, the Canadians, but so much struggle, so much success. It's quite amazing, and as we all have said, resilience, even in hard times and in tragic circumstances, resilience is so important. A wonderful chat with composer Richard Thompson and conductor Stephen Tucker. We're talking about the 2-CD Navona release, 2019, Thompson's chamber opera in 3 acts, The Mask in the Mirror, and it's the tragic romance of Paul Laurence Dunbar, and he was the first really successful black poet in the turn of the last century, and novelist Alice Ruth Moore. All of this, the interview, the links to buy the CD, all that good stuff, everybody's bio, all that stuff's going to go up at performingartsreview.net, and I will follow Gulp as I get caught up on a whole raft of reviews to get caught up. I will follow with my own written review that I'll put up at the site later too, and that'll give you a double whammy whack. We'll throw it out with the review, interview, and then we'll throw it out a few weeks later with the review up to people. I hope in my audience there are really quite a number of professional musicians. I hope that this will draw some attention. Many thanks, you two. Thank you for a wonderful chat.
Thanks, Dan.
Thank you so much.
We'll see you. Bye-bye.